NASA Lifelines. Launched in October 2023, NASA Lifelines is a series of community building experiments designed to bring together humanitarians, scientists, policymakers, frontline communities, and others to accelerate the use of satellite data and tools in support of our most vulnerable communities, and thereby unlock the benefits of satellite data for before, during, and after humanitarian use cases. Lifelines was designed in response to NASA and our community feeling that there is still significant unrealized potential for earth science to help humanitarians in their work. So today there are over 5,000 humanitarian organizations globally serving 362 million people who are currently experiencing humanitarian emergencies. And today, only 1% of humanitarian aid budgets go towards innovation. We can do better, and we need to do better. So Lifelines asks, what needs to happen for humanitarians to use more earth science? And there are a few things that we're hearing from our community. First and foremost, it's about awareness building, and not just knowing that earth science is there and it's a valuable tool, but knowing how to take advantage of it. You know, humanitarians don't often know what resources to tap into, what data sets are going to map into their use cases, and they don't know who to partner with. Second, they also need access to expertise, in-house capacity to work with satellite and other geospatial data in many humanitarian organizations is minimal. So the access to the technical expertise is limited, and it is certainly not equitable. So while there is this willingness to adopt new approaches, they need access to the partners and the experts who can really help them. Third, it's really about fit for purpose earth science. And so that means that they need the data, the tools, the models, the trainings that are designed for the humanitarian context and designed with their purposes in mind. The environments that they're operating in are fast paced. These are complex crises, oftentimes in very low bandwidth environments. And so we need to take into account, who we're really creating the tools for. On the other hand, Lifelines asks what needs to happen for scientists to better support humanitarian needs as well. First, we need intentional networking. Scientists want more time and opportunities to meet new collaborators, to work on new topics and issues, and to make sure that the science that they are doing is actually going to be impactful. Second, scientists want access to funding. No surprise there. But they need to be able to implement their ideas and their research and to pursue new ideas with collaborators and to really actually scale the things that they're working on with their partners. And then last but not least, scientists want to have impact with their work, and humanitarians are a pathway to that. So what does NASA Lifeline's mission accomplished really look like? In 2026, we're focused on fostering new collaborations between humanitarians and scientists, policymakers, affected communities, these different groups we've discussed, and improving awareness of their respective goals and needs among each other. We're focused on improving the accessibility of scientific tools and resources, which today's showcase is part of that objective. And of course, we're focused on unlocking more funding for this kind of work. Over the next couple of years, Mission Accomplished will see more humanitarians using earth science for more purposes and for more diverse purposes. And then ultimately, Mission Accomplished is going to look like really scaling these applications to secure more effective, more efficient, and more equitable humanitarian action. So finally, I just wanted to give you all a look at the solar system of our programming. Each program is designed to suit the needs of these different groups of actors that we've discussed today, and they're designed at varying levels of engagement as well. So our Ready for Impact program, it's a high level of engagement. It's an incubator and fundraising platform for scientists and humanitarians who have really, cutting edge innovations. It's for them to really figure out how to scale and give them the resources that they need to scale this work. Our Earth Science Review Board, it's really for anyone who's working on research and is in need of external experts' input. So much multidisciplinary research is needed to really achieve the objectives that we're talking about here today. And so being able to tap into different experts is truly critical to achieving meaningful impact. Our Supper Club is a low barrier to entry way to engage and can connect with the full community of actors and people advancing earth science applications. And if you're unfamiliar with Lifelines, the Supper Clubs is a great place to start. It's incidentally how I first engaged with this team. And then, another program of ours, of course, is the Community Tools Program. So I'll hand the floor over to Seamus in just a moment, but I just wanted to say thank you all again so much for being here. If you have any questions or interests in lifelines or these different programming options, please do reach out to us. But with that, Seamus, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Emma. I'm going to chat very briefly before I hand it over to a number of our other fellows to dig into the main topics of discussion and conversation today. But to set a little bit of the stage and some context around Lifeline's community tools and this initiative and kind of why we're all here today. So over the last couple of years that Lifelines has been around, we've been working kind of across the continuum of humanitarians, people working in crisis response and disaster response, as well as scientists, technologists, and academics. And what we've been finding and consistently hearing is that there's not just a single sticking point around these humanitarian data challenges, but rather a series of hurdles that prevent humanitarians from taking advantage of remote sensing to improve the outcomes of their interventions and responses. While there's certainly more beyond this, such as technical and resource limitations, the primary struggles can be summarized down in 5 challenges. Humanitarians often don't know what data is useful. If they know which data is useful, they don't often know what is available. If they know what is available, they don't often know how to access it, or for example, the access tools are unwieldy and unintuitive. If they manage to identify it, find it, and download it, there are often extra processing steps that require technological know-how. And then finally, if they make it through all of those steps, they still face the challenge of using those data to generate actionable insights. So how do we work to overcome those barriers? NASA Lifelines and kind of our community are taking a stab at it, so to speak, attempting to resolve some of those challenges for humanitarians by starting with the challenging questions that humanitarians are trying to answer and building a collection of resources backwards from there. The intention is, rather than providing a data asset or a code base or software tools that work across many different applications, let's, for example, look at a humanitarian challenge and decide what is relevant for that use case and for those users and decision makers. We want to approach the problem from the perspective of the humanitarians working to respond to these crises, working to save lives and mitigate disasters, right? What does a humanitarian in Bangladesh who is concerned about the resilience of health services to flooding need to know? What tools will benefit them? What data sets are available to them for anticipatory action, for response, for building resilience? Can we assemble meaningful way for these specific users and use cases? And then not only that, can we provide those resources with the context and education needed for that decision maker? So a lot of things. We are not trying to build some master repository of geospatial data, nor are we really going to be hosting any assets ourselves at all. There are organizations that already host these open source data sets, such as OCHA's Humanitarian Data Exchange, HDX, many of you are probably familiar with, Source Cooperative, or even NASA's Earth Explorer. Hosting data is not a significant part of Lifeline's program. Lifelines instead intends to leverage the existing platforms and do so in a way that helps to tackle some of those challenges that we just looked at, and provide context for the use of those data and information regarding the applications. So under NASA Lifeline's Community Tools Initiative, we have 2 main resource types: decision-making guides on one hand that offer a satellite data suitability assessment framework that allow decision makers and other users to assess if, when, and how satellite data might be a useful tool for their use case, along with other ethical considerations and details on when satellite data might not, in fact, be the best tool for the job. And then on the other hand, Data Studio packages, which are comprised of descriptive case studies to kind of wrap your head around how satellite data and tools are being applied to a specific use case, collection of tools and dashboards relevant to that use case, and then helpful data sets and technical how-tos of varying complexity that help users build and implement their own workflows. here on the screen is this satellite data suitability assessment framework. I'm not going to go into too much detail here in the interest of time, but check it out up on the website. This is intended for folks to, as I just shared, come to this guide with a question in mind, or some sort of challenge that they're facing within kind of the humanitarian and crisis action cycle, and be able to look at, is satellite data right for me? And not only that, look at a couple of specific considerations that kind of talk them through assessing if, when, and how this data is fit for purpose, or satellite data more broadly is fit for purpose for a specific use case, and then kind of dig into what could our approach be? What are the solutions that have already been developed? And that's where it then ties into the data studio as well. And then importantly, sharing and communicating results. So I encourage folks to go and check that resource out and see how it might be able to be in service of some things that you're working on. And then data studio packages, again, are these collections of case studies, again, trying to wrap your head around and see what is the state of how satellite data and tools are being used, for example, wildfire early warning and rapid response, seeing, varying levels of maybe a story map that kind of walks you through in a more descriptive way to maybe an academic paper trying to cater to different audiences who are coming to the table with the same question. Dashboards, tools, other things that allow folks to take it one step forward and maybe access some quote unquote decision ready resources, or access to that information in a more catered and kind of fine-tuned way. And then also data assets, and then technical how-tos at varying levels of technical complexity, which is one of the more challenging pieces that we've been trying to wrap our heads around. But I think also from what we've been hearing from the community, where there's a lot of opportunity and value, these are workflows that actually walk folks through, for example, how to build a wildfire early warning and rapid response system, or at least that piece of that broader system that uses satellite data and tools. So now with that, it's a privilege to hand it over to our Lifelines fellows who've been working tirelessly over the past 6 months, and some of them even over the last year, assembling working groups, researching and developing use case specific decision-making guides and data studio packages that apply the suitability assessment framework and this data studio's approach. And they've done so on the topics of food security, conflict-related building damage assessment, and disease risk. So you'll now hear a couple of 15-minute presentations on each of these topics, along with a 5-minute Q&A following each topic or each use case. So if you have questions, please feel free to drop those down in the chat, or once we enter into that Q&A, feel free to raise your hand and we'll invite you to come off mute and ask your question to the team. But with that, I will officially hand it over to Barira and Caroline for their case study on food security.
Thank you so much, Seamus. And thank you everyone for being here. My name is Caroline Crystal, and I am a research fellow with NASA Lifelines. And alongside Barira Rashid, I'll be presenting our food security and famine early warning decision-making guide and data studio package. Next slide. So starting with context, food insecurity and famine remain among the world's most severe humanitarian challenges, and satellite data can strengthen how we understand and respond to them. In particular, Earth observations can expand monitoring capabilities when traditional ground-based monitoring is impossible or unreliable due to insecurity, hazards, or other access restrictions. For instance, conflict is a primary driver of food insecurity in many of the most affected areas. So with this in mind, Earth observations can support a range of users and entry points to food security work, from famine review committees to donors, humanitarian organizations, and local responders. The tools we're presenting today can help these decision makers and others, including those who value data-driven approaches but may not have remote sensing expertise. Next slide. Many different satellite data sources can inform food security work, and the decision-making guide and data studio package can help orient practitioners to the landscape of relevant data and tools. For instance, satellite data can be used to observe parameters related to the environment and agriculture, such as vegetation and rangeland health, cropland extent and crop type mapping, and water availability, for instance, through soil moisture, evapotranspiration, precipitation measures for drought monitoring. And these parameters are what the Data Studio package primarily focuses on. That being said, satellite data can also capture other information related to food systems more broadly, including cropland damage from flooding and fire, damage to food infrastructure, including, sorry, do you mind muting yourself if you are unmuted? I'm catching a bit of an echo. Thank you. So other parameters include damage to food infrastructure, including conflict-related silos and stores, and food access signals, such as pattern of life monitoring at markets and fields. And then finally, satellite data can provide critical operational support, including in the form of aid targeting, for instance, by locating displaced or otherwise affected populations, and route planning, including by assessing road and airstrip damage, unexploded ordnance, and local security conditions. Next slide. In this way, satellite data can support a variety of decisions related to food security, and this includes early warning and anticipatory action to forecast conditions from vegetation, precipitation, soil moisture, extreme weather, and position resources early. Satellite data can also support food security assessments as well as emergency response and resource allocation to show where conditions have deteriorated and affected populations are concentrated. And as previously mentioned, Earth observations can provide operational support for food assistance. And satellite data has been used for program monitoring and evaluation to track conditions before, during, and after interventions to assess outcomes. And finally, satellite data can also provide a potential source of evidence and accountability, for instance, by documenting intentional starvation campaigns and attacks on food resources. I won't spend too long on these, but just so you have some examples of what this can look like, on the left is an assessment conducted by Malawi's Ministry of Agriculture with support from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and NASA Harvest. And this assessment estimated flood damage to cropland in Malawi by combining satellite imagery with field surveys through a mobile app following Tropical Cyclone Freddy in March 2023. And then on the right, the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab and Oak Ridge National Laboratory used very high resolution satellite imagery and custom object detection algorithms to assess conflict-related damage to food storage infrastructure in Ukraine. With that, I will pass to Barira to discuss the Data Studio package.
Caroline, I am Barira, and I am involved in the Data Studios initiative. So here I'll be walking you through the workflow of the Data Studios. So the Data Studios workflows are organized by the level of analysis. Instead of starting with the data set and asking you to figure out what to do with it, this package starts with the real world questions that humanitarian teams actually face and work backwards from there. So there are 3 entry points: a beginner track using ready-made dashboards, an intermediate track that is used for indicator analysis, and an advanced track for building fully integrated monitoring systems. Each one is paired with a real case study, so you can see exactly how the workflow plays out in the field. Next slide. So at the beginner level, we do not recommend, like, the complexity level is no GIS or coding requirement. So this is about getting oriented with NASA's Earth data and learning to read the landscape through existing web dashboards like HungerMap, FuseNet, GeoGlam. The goal is simple: browse vegetation, soil map, rainfall, and compare conditions to the normal ones and communicate what you are seeing in plain and non-technical terms. This is the best starting point for the humanitarian practitioners who are new to the space. So for this level, no prior remote sensing background is needed, and also there is no requirement for software installation. So you can be up and interpreting maps within an hour or so. So do not be bought away or with the time limitation in this, but it is for quick interpretation. So in this, our case study here is Malawi, which is kind of described by Caroline in her examples as well. So after Cyclone Freddy hit, EO data is estimated crop loss across more than 2,000 fields within days. That speed is the whole value of working at this dashboard level, fast, accessible situational awareness when time matters the most without needing a dedicated analyst on the staff. Next slide. So moving up a level, this track is for the analysts ready to extract and interpret data directly. It starts with pulling vegetation index like NDVI and rainfall data through tools like Appears, Google Earth Engine, then computing anomalies and layering in soil moisture for a fuller picture. From there, findings get formatted as evidence for IPC and FuseNet reporting. So this does require some basic GIS experience, but no advanced programming background is needed. In this, the case study is El Fasher. Imagery and field data helped confirm a famine in 2024 in an area that was completely cut off from ground access. The evidence combined satellite imagery analysis and imagery analysis of the graveyards near the displacement camps used as a proxy for the rising death rates, together with the malnutrition screening data collected before the situation actually intensified. So it is a powerful example of how remote and field-based indicators can be combined together to reach a defensible conclusion when direct access simply isn't possible. Next slide. So at the advanced level, we have cloud native pipelines and training machine learning models, for example, cropland or damage detection models that run automatically as new imagery comes in. This is where multiple indicators get fused into a single agricultural stress index, and results are published out to partner dashboards for wider use across the humanitarian community. This track is built for technical teams developing operational reproducible systems, and it calls for a real pipeline development and ML skills. The case study here is Ukraine's grain storage infrastructure, where ML-based imagery analysis found that about 21.5% of the country's grain storage capacity was damaged, which comprised roughly about 427 facilities. That's the kind of insight only an integrated automated system can surface at scale, which can encompass an entire country. Next slide. So here's the summary of what's inside the Data Studio package. The Data Studio mirroring the three experience levels that we just discussed. Each section stands on its own, so you only need to go as deep as your project actually requires. There is no obligation to walk through each tier. So you've got how-to guides rated at different technical complexity levels. As of now, we are still working through how to rank them, but in the current state, it is ranked between 1 to 10. And like discussed before, there is beginner level with no coding requirement, intermediate with basic GIS knowledge, and advanced level where you need to have a programming background as well. Then there are raw data assets, which includes NDVI, rainfall, and soil moisture with access instructions for anyone who's ready to go deeper into those. And the case studies, Malawi's crop loss, Sudan's famine evidence, and Ukraine's storage damage. So start wherever fits your work and go as far as your project needs. The package is designed to meet you at your own level, not the other way around. So with that, I'll pass it off to Caroline here.
Thanks so much, Barira. And here I'm going to talk about the other tools that the decision-making guide provides to help get you started. For instance, the guide describes expected costs of conducting this analysis, including personnel time, costs by type of data, and how to access humanitarian discounts, as well as options for cloud storage. The guide also describes the kinds of expertise you'll need, including technical expertise for remote sensing and GIS work, domain expertise to understand local context and food security dynamics, and implementation expertise to conduct the analysis and connect it to real decision-making processes. So in this vein, the guide walks through how to match analysis complexity to your available capacity and how to develop partnerships to fill any remaining institutional gaps. And it also introduces users to points of contact for continued support, including specific capacity building partners. The guide also provides additional decision support tools, such as a list of case studies organized by application area, so you can see how similar work has been implemented previously. And the report's decision scoping and technical scoping tools help scientific and operational partners complete and iterate on pre-made templates to communicate their specific needs and align on assumptions, scope, and expected outputs. Finally, the decision-making guide helps users work through certain limits and ethical considerations in using satellite data for food security. For instance, the guide emphasizes that technical work needs local knowledge. This is primarily because satellite data captures observable correlates and not necessarily food insecurity itself. And for instance, judgments such as distinguishing agricultural burning from conflict-related arson attacks may depend on knowledge of local practices, seasonal calendars, and social context. And the report also provides guidance on how to navigate gaps and uncertainty that come with Earth observations, from general limitations such as spatial and spectral resolution to certain gaps specific to food security work, such as limits to remote sensing equivalents for malnutrition and mortality measurements. And it also describes what dimensions of food security Earth observations are best suited to measure. Finally, the guide emphasizes ethical use, especially related to conflict sensitivity and protection, providing general guidance to protect against misuse and support the proper application of humanitarian and data protection principles. So in closing, we want to extend our gratitude to the experts who contributed to this case study, and special thanks also to NASA Lifeline's colleagues for their support and guidance. To learn more, you can find the full report and companion Data Studio package online at NASA Lifelines. Thank you so much. And happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Caroline and Briera. Open floor, if anybody has a question and would like to pose it to Caroline, Briera, or anybody from the Lifelines team, please raise your hand. We have a couple moments to field those now. And maybe while not seeing any hands, maybe while folks are thinking, one question, Caroline and Briera, maybe you guys can speak a little bit more to, in that second to last slide, you talked a lot about how satellite data and remotely sensed data don't actually detect food security or food insecurity, they're correlates. And I'm curious, speak a little bit to the importance of ground truth data, and I think that that's a constant consideration across any of these case studies. But curious if you can speak a little bit to what happens when ground truth data isn't available to validate when what the satellite data is showing, and how you handle that. I don't know if you can speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the question, Seamus. So yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, you would have something like the case study we presented with Malawi, where they were actually able to conduct field surveys, but that's obviously not always possible. So essentially, you try and include validation measures in the way you can, from using models that have been validated in your particular context. For instance, some might be built on training data that was developed in Europe, for instance, instead of Africa. So you want to make sure it's as specific as possible, including geographically, to, including if you don't have the ground data, then consulting or otherwise involving local partners is a critical piece of that. And you really want to see if you can engage people early to build lasting relationships there. And, also worth mentioning that local organizations often might be producing their own evidence as well and be able to contribute things other than the ground data validation that you're looking for and ultimately produce more robust analysis.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I see another hand up. I can't quite see your name, but please come off mute or Kayla, yeah, jump in.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. My name's Kayla. I work with Servier, which is in collaboration with Spatial Informatics Group, our nonprofit side. And I was wondering, since we're working on kind of a global toolkit, which is a platform where all of our tools can exist, one of our partners raised this question, and I wanted to see how you guys are approaching this. Since we're a global collaborative, we're working with people all around the world who speak a variety of different languages, and we want it to be accessible to whoever wants to interact with that tool set. So are you guys dealing with any of the similar issues where you have users that are working with your tools in different languages? And do you have outputs that can communicate with people in different languages? Is the front end facing side also accessible in different languages? So yeah, I'm wondering how you guys are dealing with the accessibility issue with languages in a global tool.
Yeah, excellent question. And right now, the information is primarily being presented in English. But as you call out, it's such an important piece. And I think as we're looking to develop this program further, I would love to have a conversation with you or your team and have a bit of a meeting of the minds to try to figure out how to make that accessible. I think that accessibility piece to language, but also to geography and the specific context that any one person who might be coming to the data studios and needing a specific piece of information, inevitably to create one data studio package that is encompassing food security, right? There's a lot more nuance that can't possibly be captured in there. And so we're exploring ways of how can we further tailor these to specific users that walk through the door and need this information. And I don't think that we've cracked that code yet, but it's something that's on our radar and would be very interested and curious to continue this conversation, Kayla, if you're interested, and we could reach out. But it's such an important consideration and a very critical one. So I appreciate you raising that question.
Yeah, I would love that. I can send you my email.
Excellent. Awesome. I think we have time for one more question before we need to continue on. I see Sunny has their hand up, and I see your question in the chat as well. Seamus will do our best to answer it in the chat, but Sunny, go ahead and come off mute and ask your question.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So thanks so much. I essentially have attended many NASA events, just so that everyone is aware of that. So first, big props to your team. You guys have done a great job here. My former role, I was the Global Managing Director of Innovation for Accenture, which just means that we accelerate products, a lot of products, using emerging technologies. And just wanted to kind of build on the earlier question of, hey, how do we make this more accessible? One of the things that I've been sharing at many of the NASA events that I've been attending is that, oftentimes people that actually develop product are not invited to the table or in the room. And when you include a product developer into, how to use the data set, but more important, how to scale it, because the people that need the information, they actually need to use it. It's not just a one-off paper or, And so you guys are doing such great work because you're making the data accessible. I wanted to sort of raise my hand to say, if you guys need a sort of thinking partner in terms of, okay, but how do we scale this to drive usage? Because ultimately, as a humanitarian, that's what we have to do, is we have to scale these great data sets that you have, but scale the usage of them. And the people that do that best are people that know how to build product across lots of different industries. Thank you.
Excellent. Really appreciate that. And I think it ties in well with the point that Kayla was making, and how can we scale these resources to reach, create more accessibility to a broader audience. And so absolutely would love to connect after the fact and reach out. Thank you for sharing. In the interest of time, we're going to keep going, but any other questions that you have, drop them in the chat. Or if we have time at the end, happy to hang on a little after the call if folks want to stick around and discuss anything further. But with that, I will open up the floor to Sophie and Brian, who are going to chat us through a similar case study, or different topic, but similarly on conflict-related building damage assessments. Over to you guys.
Thanks, Seamus, and hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Brian Perlman, and I'm a Lifelines Research Fellow. This portion of the Lifelines work focuses on damage assessments in conflict-affected areas. The team working on this consists of 2 Lifelines fellows, Sophie Hayes, who built the Damage Assessment Data Studio package, which is available on the Lifelines website, and myself, and I wrote the Humanitarian Decision-Making Guide, which as of yesterday is also now available on the Lifelines website. Next slide, please, Seamus. So conflict-related building damage assessments, why is this important? So even though civilian infrastructure is protected by the laws of armed conflict, we have observed over the last several years the intentional and strategic targeting of civilian infrastructure across armed conflict contexts perpetrated by both state and non-state actors. Civilian objects such as healthcare facilities and water, sanitation, and hygiene infrastructure are widely understood to be off limits for targeting. But perversely, it is this specific protected status afforded to civilian objects that oftentimes entices armed actors to pursue destruction of these types of civilian infrastructure if they intend to occupy territory and displace civilians out of contested areas. Destroying critical civilian infrastructure is an explicit tactic we've observed in various conflict contexts, but prominent examples include Ukraine, Sudan, and Gaza. And this has been documented not just by journalists and humanitarian actors, but also by academics in the peer-reviewed literature. During periods of active hostilities, humanitarian decision makers need to know the locations of damaged infrastructure, as well as the damage severity and the bottom line effects that this damage will have on civilian populations. For example, will this damage result in a lack of access to hospitals for civilians caught up in conflict? Will it result in water shutoffs, making life impossible in affected areas, and how many people are affected? These are really important questions for humanitarians to answer, and they need to be answered quickly when civilian life is at risk. Earth observation, or EO as it's referred to, imagery, can help humanitarians in establishing these facts, and I've experienced firsthand how essential satellite imagery is to multilaterals like the UN and other humanitarian partners in crisis scenarios. Once conclusions have been drawn from EO-based damage assessments, there are many additional downstream humanitarian use cases that EO data can assist with. These include planning safe passage routes for IDPs and refugees, deciding where and how to allocate humanitarian aid such as food and shelter, and quite further downstream applications such as accountability investigations that happen both inside the UN via fact-finding missions, commissions of inquiry, etc., but also outside the UN system by partners such as human rights NGOs like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, which both have robust EO capacity in-house. After the cessation of hostilities, transitional justice mechanisms can focus on tenets such as establishing an accurate historical record of what happened, which is where EO data can really add value, and guarantees of non-recurrence, among other TJ tenets. Next slide, please, Seamus. Here are a couple of examples of how EO data has been used by both large IGOs as well as humanitarian researchers and academics. On the left, we have an example of a report published by the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, which describes how they use satellite imagery to map locations of thermal scarring in an IDP camp in North Darfur in March of this year, resulting in the displacement of 971 households, destroying 881, and partially damaging 90 shelters. At least 2 people were reported killed, including 1 child from the fire, which was due to overcrowding and the use of flammable shelters. And on the right, we have an rDNA, or a Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment, conducted jointly by the World Bank, UN, and EU. The report details damage on a per sectoral basis, measuring damage, for example, to wash infrastructure, healthcare facilities, or in this case we see here, education facilities, which often doubled as displacement camps for IDPs in the Gaza Strip. EO is an important aspect of these types of reports, as access on the ground can be risky due to ongoing hostilities, and access has also been limited by armed actors themselves. So satellite imagery plays an important role in understanding the damage status of key civilian infrastructure. Next slide, Seamus. In terms of how to frame EO-based damage assessments, how they can be helpful for humanitarians, we have to be clear-eyed on what kinds of tasks EO imagery is well suited to, and on the flip side, where EO may provide only limited utility. For example, manual interpretation of optical satellite imagery may not be able to give you the full picture of the extent of damage, especially in cases where buildings are damaged but roofs are left intact, or in cases in which violence is occurring inside of buildings, in densely forested areas, or is being physically concealed by armed actors themselves. EO also has the constraint of being highly technical and requiring a significant amount of training and experience to be able to work with that data in an accurate and scientifically sound way. There are also, of course, access constraints, such as what we've seen with the current Iran war conflict, in which several American commercial EO companies limited access to imagery over many areas in the Middle East and beyond the Middle East, not only to public-facing researchers, journalists, and human rights investigators, but also to large multilaterals like the UN, which I've personally experienced, who need access to the data internally to be able to operate. And lastly, as I mentioned this before, deep expertise is needed to work with EO data properly, and there are many different types of skills needed that would be impossible for one single person to have mastery over. For example, manual interpretation of optical satellite imagery is one skill that analysts can be trained to do, but working with AI and machine learning models to help automate analytical tasks is a completely different skill set that requires different educational backgrounds, such as computer science and computer vision. Then we have the challenge of parlaying remote sensing knowledge into actionable information, such as being able to identify different types of military hardware and arms and munitions, and understanding their capabilities and which armed groups operate them and how they tend to use them. These are very disparate skill sets that require many years of focus to hone, and asking one person to have all the technical knowledge is unrealistic. So being able to identify which skills and which areas of expertise are needed for a specific use case is key, as is partnering and forming interdisciplinary teams who come from different backgrounds, but who can work together to achieve results. Next slide, Seamus. So just a couple of different examples here of how EO imagery can be used for damage assessments by different types of actors. For example, here on the top, we see a humanitarian use case in which the goal is to provision aid to shore up wash infrastructure that was damaged by war with resources such as water trucks and small-scale desalination plants. EO plays an important role here in identifying pre-conflict locations of wash infrastructure, and then during the conflict, assessing the damage status of each piece of wash infrastructure so that civilians can be supported. And we see some examples of EO modalities here that can be helpful, such as VHR optical imagery. And on the bottom side of the slide here, we have a human rights use case in which investigators at the ICC or another international war crimes tribunal can prosecute those who have violated the laws of armed conflict by intentionally attacking protected civilian infrastructure. In this case, leveraging the already deep OSINT expertise in-house at the ICC, EO imagery can be fused to provide the locations of armed actors and establish facts around what types of munitions were used, where they were used, and when. And for EO tools, we have, again, the VHR optical imagery supplemented by VHR SAR, synthetic aperture radar, and hyperspectral imagery, which can be used to locate armed forces that are attempting to obfuscate their location and equipment. Next slide, Seamus. Best practices. So some of these include knowing your data inside and out. It's often that we've noticed that those in positions sometimes tend to make decisions based on EO data who may not have had any exposure to the raw data itself, or how the analyses were conducted, how conclusions were drawn, or even the results of EO analyses themselves. And as such, may be making suboptimal decisions based on inaccurate or incomplete data. So having a deep understanding under the hood of how EO works and what goes into producing these types of analyses will be very helpful to ensure that decisions are truly evidence-based. And having interdisciplinary teams made up of people from all levels in a diversity of experience should help with this. Then it's also important to communicate in any work product how we arrived at our conclusions, providing a robust methodology and being clear about the limitations of our analysis and how confident we are in the results. Another best practice is creating a structure for training and mentorship. And I personally benefited from having been mentored and taught by those who are very experienced in their geospatial careers. And this is an invaluable way to learn from previous mistakes and how to avoid pitfalls, whether that's in analytical processes or problems that arise from poor communication. And lastly, to have a deep understanding of how EO data works, all the different modalities we have available, when to use them, and as well as each of their strengths and drawbacks. Next slide, please. And just to wrap up here, this is an example of what different types of optical satellite sensors are capable of. Oftentimes people will say, well, why don't we just use freely available imagery? There's no restrictions on how we can use it. We can get it very easily, publish it anywhere, and it doesn't cost us anything. That may work if you need to identify general areas of potential damage, but if you need to have building level specificity or high levels of certainty in your results, especially with optical satellite imagery, you really need to be working with VHR or very high resolution imagery. And just to note here, we're referred to VHR imagery as any imagery with a spatial resolution of sub 1 meter ground sample distance. You can see here on the top row what coarse and moderate resolution sensors can provide. This is all, by the way, the same area in Gaza, imaged around the same time, plus minus a few days, by various sensors currently on orbit. You can see moderate resolution sensors provide pretty blurry imagery, and you can't really start to see some detail until you get down to at least Sentinel-2, but you're still pretty limited if you had to create a map of building level damage. It's really not possible until you get down to around 1 meter GSD or better. You see here Planet SkySat with the 83 centimeters GSD. And really the top tier in terms of spatial resolution of what is currently available, although that's rapidly changing commercially, comes from just two providers at this time, Vantor and Airbus, which provide 30 centimeter class and 40 centimeter class imagery, which we can see here with WorldView 3 imagery from Vantor at 40 centimeters GSD. You can create building level damage analyses based on VHR imagery, sub 1 meter, keeping in mind the limitations of optical methods and what might not be visible from overhead imagery, no matter how fine the spatial resolution. And just a last point here, just to wrap up, we only show optical imagery here on the slide, but there are other remote sensing modalities to consider, such as hyperspectral, thermal, SAR, and others. In the Humanitarian Decision-Making Guide, which was just published, we focus a lot on these other modalities, specifically highlighting moderate resolution SAR, which has been used very successfully by my colleagues to map damage across various conflict contexts. And we go into a bit more detail about this in the guide, which I encourage you to check out on the Lifelines website. And with that, thanks very much for your attention, and I will pass it over to Sophie for her presentation on the Damage Assessment Data Studio package.
Great, thank you, Brian. So yeah, I'm going to swing us more over to the tooling side of things with the Damage Assessment Data Studio package. So this was developed as kind of a bridge between conflict-related as well as disaster-related damage assessments, because we do have Data Studio packages that focus on specific disaster events such as landslides, wildfire, etc. Damage assessment is a huge part of response in those as well. But we were really lucky when Brian came in as a fellow with his expertise to also focus on the conflict-related building damage side of things, which is a really important part of damage assessment. So that's one thing that I'll highlight kind of in the Data Studio side of things, is that we are kind of able to integrate both of those approaches. And then also, as Brian said, balancing sort of the indispensable nature of VHR imagery with accessible analysis is also a priority for us. So including some of those moderate resolution SARs, Sentinel satellites can be really helpful in damage assessment, as well as providing pathways to acquisition of commercial satellite imagery. And a lot of those are highlighted by commercial organizations, NGOs, partners, Copernicus, Microsoft AI for Good, Planet, and other commercial satellite endeavors also have really great tools and case studies that relate to damage assessment that are included in the Data Studio package as well. And those are balanced out with open source algorithms and ML methods that Brian also goes into detail in his decision-making guide, that are also highlighted as technical tools in the Data Studio package. And on the next slide, we can kind of really get into what's included. So we have our data assets, dashboards, case studies, and then our how-to guide. The latter, which we're kind of went over the stratification of those by technical capacity. But in terms of data assets, we have a really good balance of open source and then also highlighting more like humanitarian programs within commercial satellite imagery and sort of broader companies. So Planet, Microsoft AI for Good, Copernicus Rapid Mapping have really good resources, as well as our partners at NASA ARIA damage proxy maps are really helpful for establishing semi-automated workflows, as well as, like I said, those open source algorithms. And then among our dashboards and case studies, we also have highlighted a lot of the really great work that's gone into the damage assessment space, Conflict Ecology Lab at Oregon State, UNOSAT, and then Microsoft AI for Good and independent researchers as well. And over on our how-to guides, you can see that, again, they're sort of stratified by technical capacity. So we focus on a no-code response and then get into manual annotation and then semi-automated workflows using established data sets. So on the next slide, I have our how-to guides. So we focus on 4 how-to guides in the damage assessment data studio. And these are focused around a no-code response, which is more of a crowdsourced response, working with ground verification when possible, and then satellite imagery as context, versus manual annotation and semi-automated workflows, which bring in Earth observation imagery, satellite imagery, optical, as well as SAR, LiDAR, VHR, and defining damage classes. And once you work on defining damage classes, you can work those into semi-automated workflows that use more machine learning. And all of these are designed kind of with the goal of being able to produce damage maps, quantitative statistics, and above all, reproducible workflows. That's kind of the goal with these how-tos, is really just providing a space for practitioners to go in and choose a workflow that works for them. So that is an overview of our damage assessment data studio. I want to say thank you to everyone involved in our working group, to Brian as well. It's been really great to build this out, and I can swing us to questions.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Brian. Great presentation. And again, open floor for any questions from the audience. Please raise your hand. As folks are thinking, seeing a couple of kind of reoccurring themes in the chat. Just to reiterate and confirm that all of the tools and information that's being shared in these presentations exists within the Data Studio packages, which are openly and freely accessible on the NASA Lifelines website, in addition to the suitability assessment framework in these decision-making guides. So if you head to the website, and we shared a couple of links in the chat, you can access these and take it a step further. Click into links, read about the different case studies, explore the different methods, look at the different how-tos and technical walkthroughs. One question or kind of theme that I think has been coming up that I can pose, Brian, to you and Sophie while folks are thinking, is kind of around, what it actually takes to bring together the different kinds of expertise that this work requires, and specifically with damage assessments. I feel like it's, different case studies require different kind of baseline levels of expertise and levels of complexity to do a specific analysis. Taking food security, for example, running normalized difference vegetation index versus doing semi-automated or automated damage assessment looks a lot different. And so I'm curious if you can speak a little bit to, when do you decide to rely on partnerships and folks that are doing this work? And I know you call out a couple of those in the guide, versus trying to build up this capacity in-house. Is there, some sort of tipping point or indicator of when you would choose one approach versus the other?
Thanks for the question, Seamus. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question and something that's really challenging for a lot of humanitarian organizations to, it's a challenging task because oftentimes they're resource constrained, they're maybe personnel constrained, maybe they have a small team, maybe only a few people. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of different skill sets that go into doing this properly, and it depends on the approach, right? So if you want to do an automated approach that requires, coding skills, perhaps computer science skills, computer vision skills, obviously GIS skills. If you want to do manual analysis, you have a team of a few people doing manual damage labeling. That's a completely different skill set, and knowing how to manually interpret whether that's optical imagery, VHR SAR imagery, moderate resolution optical imagery. These are all different skill sets, and so I think it's a challenge for humanitarian organizations to sort of build all of that. It's impossible to have a full bench within, but reaching out to other partners who may have those skill sets within their teams, and like I said, having interdisciplinary teams of people from a variety of backgrounds, diversity of experience, and all different levels, I think will sort of aid in helping that challenge.
Great answer. Thank you. And maybe a shameless plug before we move forward is our NASA Lifelines has an Earth Science Review Board that Emma introduced as well, where we have a bench of experts. Brian is one of those, and others who are experts within damage assessments. If you are grappling with these questions or want support or access to some of this expertise, don't hesitate to reach out to us there, or otherwise. With that, any other questions, maybe drop them in the chat and we'll keep cruising, and I will hand it over to Maya, who is going to take us away on looking at a disease risk case study.
Perfect. Thank you, Seamus. So I get to round us out and talk about the use of EO for disease risk and disease risk mapping. And I also really want to give a special shout out to Michelle Schmitz, who created our Data Studio package for this work, but who was not able to join us today. So I will try my very best to tackle her creation in this short presentation. So when we think about why we would want to use satellite data and tools, EO, for looking and thinking about disease risk, there are two real key reasons in this. The first being that we know that humanitarian contexts are really good for the spread of infectious diseases. The environments that natural hazards or conflict create, such as a destruction of infrastructure, displacement, overcrowding, are really prime environments for the spread of pathogens. And then we also know that a lot of these pathogens or vectors tend to be quite responsive to changes in both the built and natural environment. So that comes back to, again, these changes in infrastructure, but also things like precipitation or temperature. And these also interact with the changes that we're seeing in the built environment. So these tools, these satellite data and tools, can help users understand things like areas that may face increased risk based on things like flooding or building damage or poor healthcare access. And this is especially true when we can link health data to these satellite data and tools and use that to help inform things like anticipatory action so that we can respond to growing outbreaks faster and more efficiently. And so we can use satellite data and tools for a variety of health outcomes. You'll notice in the guide that we tend to focus on malaria and cholera as examples throughout the case study, just because of their prevalence in humanitarian contexts. But these tools are really broadly applicable across a variety of health-related outcomes. So Seamus, if you could take me to the next slide, and these are just three kind of key components that we used throughout our guide as kind of a framework. And the first is that we ask the question of the risk of what and to what or whom. And we encourage users to really zoom in on that as their first question. And so when we think of the risk of what, here we're talking about disease incidence. Is it a particular hazard that we're worried about? And then to what or whom being, are we thinking about the general population? Are we thinking about a subpopulation or an entire system like healthcare operations? And then we also emphasize that the key role that satellite data and tools can fill here is as a complement and a gap-filling tool for existing tools. So for example, the Global Task Force on Cholera Control has an existing tool to identify areas or hotspots that may be at increased cholera risk based on a number of epidemiological factors. But satellite data can step in and help fill in gaps on things like vulnerability based on precipitation or flooding, or it can update these kind of hotspot IDs at a more frequent interval. It can also help do things like refine anticipatory action triggers so that they can be more responsive to things like increases in temperature or drought. And now lastly, we borrow from IPCC's framework of risk, which includes hazard, exposure, and vulnerability as these 3 core determinants of risk in this work. And each of these calls for a very different type of response. So for example, 2 areas that have the same hazard could face really different outcomes depending on its vulnerability. But then vulnerability can also really shift based on things like response capacity. And importantly, EO can help us kind of in each phase of this risk component. And so we're already seeing satellite data and tools in action in a lot of disease risk mapping. And on the next slide, we'll see 2 examples. The first being DIRE, which is done in collaboration with UC San Diego, UNICEF, and New Light Technologies. And that uses some machine learning tools that are partially informed by satellite data and tools to help show where dengue and malaria cases occur in Brazil and Peru. And then it also helps predict where cases may occur in the subsequent month. And on the right-hand side, we have an output from the Lebanon WASH sector, which use satellite data on drought vulnerability to add that to an existing cholera risk hotspot map to define at the district level areas of increased risk for waterborne diseases throughout the country. And so on the next slide, we can think about what are kind of our use cases that we would see for examples that we go through in our case study. And these are just 2, but you'll see in the table, or you see in our guide that we have a much longer table that are some examples for this use. It is non-exhaustive. So the first being if you're interested in doing something like monitoring mosquito breeding sites after flooding, EO can step in and help detect where surface water may be accumulating. And that can be through looking at things like flood extent, surface water data, land use land cover, population. And that would be really helpful to know where we may see increased malaria risk because of this flooding incident. On the other hand, we could do like we've talked about, so build on existing tools to determine high-risk cholera outbreak zones by adding in these environmental factors onto existing risk maps. And so that can look at things like health facility, it can look at things like damage to infrastructure and roads, as well as this environmental data. And importantly, we can pair EO data with non-EO data that's really critical when it comes to health response. And this includes things like WASH functionality, as well as existing disease cases, and especially historical case data. So then on the next slide, we'll look at kind of what we encourage users to think about as our major categories of data. And these are all included in the Data Studio that has been linked to in the chat. But before diving into this, it's really important for users to first consider what their minimum required indicators will be specifically for their disease or outcome of interest, and then their intended use for this work. But by and large, environmental data is a really good place to start. And we have links to a bunch of different satellites or tools or existing dashboards, both within the Data Studio and within the case and within the guide itself. And we also have some disease-specific ones. So ones that are going to be more useful depending on if you're looking at a vector-borne disease versus something like cholera. And then we also really encourage users to link with existing health response teams or disease surveillance teams that would have access to things like case data and specifically historical case data to help look at trends and especially seasonal trends for some pathogens. Population estimates too are also quite important, obviously, when it comes to disease response, but not only kind of a general estimation of the number of people, but also things like what's a catchment area for a specific hospital or health facility, and how long may it take people to get to that health facility, as well as things like displacement, because we know that those environments are really susceptible to disease outbreaks because of factors like overcrowding and inadequate infrastructure. We talked all about infrastructure in Brian's case study, so I'll leave that there. But then we also really want to think about these non-EO tools. And again, to link those with these wonderful satellite data and tools, we want to look at things like vaccination coverage or food security to really round out a more robust understanding of health risk in these environments. And then, of course, we want to think about things like spatial scale, because depending on if you are trying to do a disease response at a local scale, you may need something like village level or household level data. But if you're comparing risk between areas, something like a district level may be adequate, as well as temporal scale, right? So if you're looking at an outbreak that is a really quick moving disease, something like cholera, you need data that has short revisit times and short latency periods. So this again comes back to knowing what your outcome is and making sure that what the end use is has been made very, very concrete as you're developing this work. And that's where partnerships really come into play, because that's going to really help guide not only your data access, but also the framing for this work. And then if we dive a little bit more into the data studio, just like everybody else's that have talked about, it's broken down into these components, so I won't spend too much time on it. But just to really highlight, we do have 7 different how-to guides. And Seamus, if you go to the next slide, it will preview what those how-to guides are. And that ranges anywhere from what we've talked about, so building on that hotspot detection, to doing analyses like calculating thresholds for disease outbreak alerts within early warning systems, integrating satellite data and tools, to creating an entirely modeled disease risk surface. And so I encourage you to go into those. Just like everybody else's, they have step-by-step instructions for how you can really put this into action depending on your skill level and your technical capacity within your organization. And on the next slide, I'll just highlight briefly 5 main topic areas that we discussed throughout the guide, but there are much more within the guide itself, and these also go much more in depth. But the first that I'll highlight here is really creating those concrete end goals and considering the capacity that your entity has within this work, which we've talked about, right? And so this helps establish resources, understand the existing tools that you can use, and also leverage tools depending on your expertise and capacity. Importantly, this helps determine what the actual output could be. Will that be a static risk map like we saw in the Lebanon WASH sector? Or could that be a dynamic dashboard like we saw with that Dyer dashboard in that first example? And then when we think about this translation process, if you've worked with health data before in these contexts, you know that it could be anything from an Excel document to handwritten records to an EMR. And so we need to be able to translate those epidemiological materials to be able to align with geospatial materials. And really critical here is how we talk about risk. When our whole points exercise, right, is to really establish and try to quantify risk. That's really only half the battle, because while satellite data is a powerful tool, it's only powerful insofar as its contributions and what that means specifically for health response can be properly understood. And this is really where trust in who is communicating comes into play. And then we also really emphasize having work that integrates into existing systems. So this could be into existing early warning systems, into existing surveillance systems, and into existing health response systems. We want something that plays well with others. And then lastly, any output that comes from this disease risk mapping exercise should really have explicit recommendations. So this is something like distribute 100 bed nets in District X by Friday based on these metrics. And this is also where linking and sharing with networks like in humanitarian data exchange come into play. And the last thing I'll note on the next slide is that within the guide itself, we do give very specific recommendations and best practices within these specific domains. So this includes handling health data, so things like de-identification, political sensitivity, storage practices, how to present results, so how to translate those signals into operational tasks. That requires things that are easy to interpret, require limited expertise, and again, include those recommended actions. We also know in health response, especially very active health response, There may be limited bandwidth and limited technical capacity. And so we discuss ways to handle that within these processes. And then lastly, that communicating uncertainty, right? Health is inherently something that requires a lot of trust. And so we talk about how to navigate communication that explains these outputs in operational terms, but also conveys this underlying uncertainty. And so that could be through things like showing relative risk between areas, giving a best and worst case scenario, but also guiding this conversation towards really focusing on who's communicating that result and that underlying uncertainty. And so I encourage you to turn to the guide for some more detail on each of these, but just as a preview, these are kind of the best practices that we go throughout this guide itself. And so with that, I will end it there, right under my time, and happy to take any questions.
Great presentation, Maya. Thank you. Open floor for any questions from the audience around Maya's case study around disease risk, looking at malaria and cholera. While folks are thinking, I'm seeing some stuff in the chat, and I think it's fair to say thank you, Corey, for sharing that NASA RSET training. That will certainly be linked in the Data Studio and I think is referenced in the guide. One thing that I want to mention with these Data Studio packages specifically, the idea is that these are community informed and community built. So we are in the process of rolling out a portal where folks can actually log in and build their own data studios. So tying in, Liliana, to your question around drought data studio package. We don't currently have one, but as we are rolling out data studios and trying to find new partners, or if someone works within drought and has methods or has examples that they want to share with the broader community, we'd love to partner with you to create that data studio. And so the examples that we've given were internal efforts, of course, informed by working groups and a lot of external partners to kind of build some foundations for a couple of these data studios. But the idea is that anybody out there that is working in this space and has expertise that they want to share can either contribute to existing ones or build their own. So reach out to us if that's of interest to you, and we're happy to point you in the right direction and partner with you to build something like that. Excellent. Just getting caught up on the chat. Any questions from folks still on the line as we near the end of the call? All right, that's my 10 seconds of awkward silence for folks. Well, I guess we can kind of wrap it there. We are at time of the call, bumping up against 3/4 of the hour. Wherever you're calling in from, thank you for joining us today. Myself and maybe some of the team members, if they're able, can kind of hang around if folks have any comments or questions or would like to chat. The session has been recorded, so we will be posting it for folks to refer back to, and encourage you to check out the website where you can access all the resources that were shared today, as well as hopefully get involved and engage and contribute some resources yourself, and look forward to having some conversations and follow-ups as well with some of the folks that brought up some very important considerations around accessibility, language, and all that good stuff. So yeah, thanks again for being here. We'll wrap with that. Big shout out and kudos to all the fellows, Emma, Brian, Sophie, Barrera, Caroline, Maya, and others who have contributed to this work. Shout out as well to Liz and Billy, who I think are in the room still, for pioneering some of this work back with us over a year ago and actually helping create the initial suitability assessment framework and 2 additional case studies that are on the website around human rights and flood early warning. So shout out to you both as well. But yeah, we'll wrap there. Thanks everybody for joining.